Humans eyed their new, uninvited guests with a lot of suspicion. Although there were many smirks, many side comments, many different things being said, it's a good thing they didn't understand the human languages, or they might be a little pissed off at what was said. The queen herself, or she called herself her empress, her exalted highness, and all other types of, royal bullshit. She decided that she would make sure that she, even though now a prisoner, would have an air of royalty as she kept her head up and her head straight forward as she was cuffed and brought forward to all those in charge of humanity. When brought before the Council of Nations, she looked at the hall full of humans, all of them making her feel very, very small. This was quite literal, as she only stood about 1.3 meters tall, maybe slightly taller, but that might have been simply the way she had her hair done and the ornamental dress that she wore. In reality, she looked similar to what humans would know as a halfling or almost a goblin. Her slightly greenish skin did give that off, and she was small like one, but she was not skinny like you would expect one to be. Instead, her body was stout and filled out in many locations, similar to that of a gnome, but that was just one of the many, many names that they seemed to spit out as they tried to figure out what exactly to call them. Eventually, they would settle on 03, just like those of 02. The translator, once given to her and calibrated to her language, would simply change 03 to her own species name. It was simply that the humans could not name it, although any slang terms that were coming across would translate directly, or as best they could. The translator, of course, was still limited by its software after all. As she was marched to the podium, she was given several things to step on. It seemed as though a small set of stairs was already placed so that she could stand up much taller, so that she could be seen by all as they inquired all the things they wanted. She looked around, off to the corner. She could see the forearms and the smirk of species 02, and she was grinning. From ear to ear, she grinned. That strange, salamanderish, lizardish, almost humanish smile is something she had picked up from the humans as they saw that they smiled as well. These humans, as they like to call themselves, simply looked at her and in many cases were stifling laughter. She did not understand this at first, but pretty soon she realized that every time they said strange words, they would simply chuckle slightly, trying to keep their professionalism, but it was difficult. In more than one cases, while being brought to the chamber, somebody would say something, the others would laugh, and another human would swing over with one of those strong arms and swat them rather hard, enough to let them know that that was not acceptable. She was royalty after all, and she knew they would keep decorum with her. They would never try and force anything onto her. They would never force her to do anything, as she was empress, even though she had been suckered into this trap by her forearm compatriot. She was not going to give up so easily. She looked across at each of them as the humans walked into the room, each of them sitting behind a different symbol. One symbol was white with a red dot in it. One was striped red and white. Another one was striped again with red, white, and blue. Another one was striped the same way, but in a different order. Another one used the same colors, but had a strange blue patch in the corner. It was odd. Each of these 7 members sat there and looking over. These seemed to be the most influential, but then she looked around and realized that everyone in the room had 1 or 2 sitting behind a different symbol and different characters next to the symbol itself. It was as though they were trying to differentiate themselves. She didn't understand this. How could they be so different? She looked closer and realized that they all dressed differently as well. It was odd. This was different from anything anyone had ever seen across the known universe. Everyone knows that you are all part of one government, one faith, one way of doing things, and you all followed one leader, the end-all be-all of your one species. But yet these humans were all there to hear from her. Yet she realized very quickly that the 7 that were in front of her were the ones that were going to be inquiring things. At least, mostly. Very soon a human spoke into a microphone, words she did not understand. She listened intently and then simply turned and grabbed the translator into her ear and looked at them and then made a strange gesture, shaking her hands. They all looked and were confused. The one in front of her said something again into his microphone. She again shook her hands, which was a gesture the same as a shrug in her idea. They went up and checked the translator, and then they gave it back to her. "We apologize about that, ma'am. Apparently it was not activated. Can you understand what we're saying?" She simply looked and was surprised that her own language was coming through, even though the human didn't speak it. She simply stated, "Yes, I can hear you. What do you wish of me? Why am I here?" "Well, simply put, you're here because you came after us, and we're deciding whether or not we should make an example of you, that's all." "You do not dictate to me," she staggered. "I am the Empress of 03. You will deem me with respect, and you will eventually all bow to me." She looked around, and they all seemed to have strange looks on their faces. Several of them lowered their heads and put their digits on their head and seemed to rub it back and forth. It's as though what she had said had been heard before so many times that they were simply tired of hearing of it. The one in charge simply replied to her, "Might I remind you that you lost? Your ship is now adrift in space, and right now our tugs are just trying to make sure it doesn't crash land on this planet. By the way, if it does, this entire city will be vaporized. So if I was you, I'd keep your tongue to yourself for a little while and listen." The Empress, though angry, heeded his warning. Now, I would like to know if this is true. You simply have to answer yes or no for these. Is it true that after the defeat of Species 02, you believe that they were a weaker species because they could not beat us? Yes. Is it true that you took advantage of their loss of military forces to, well, for lack of a better term, conquer them? Yes, we conquered them, as is our right. We did not ask for extras. It's simply yes or no questions. Did you come to Earth to, well, annihilate us? No. We came to subjugate you. With that, everyone simply looked at each other, and the eyes seemed to open a bit, and then close, narrowing as though they seemed to be concentrating more and more on a subject. So you came to enslave our people, ones that had already kicked the butt of your biggest rival in your area. Several sectors in every direction, from what we're understanding now as we're starting to rip apart your computers and get your history. You have no right to touch my ship. It's not your ship anymore, another voice cried out. Your ship was lost. You lost the fight, which means it is salvage and it belongs to us. That ship belongs to my species and it belongs to the hierarchy, as it belongs to me. They again reiterated, you don't have a ship anymore. If we want to, we will strip it for parts to build our fleet. Or we'll just reuse it and we'll use it as one of our own dreadnoughts. But this time we'll use weapons that actually work. With that, the Queen seemed to be a little bit put back. What do you mean, weapons that work? We are the strongest for 12 sectors in any direction. Our weapons are strong enough to fight back several different species at the same time. How dare you say they not work? Well, they couldn't kill us, could they? Well, Without any hesitation, the one in charge simply spoke up and said, "We need to calm down. Ma'am, do you understand the right of conquest?" "Yes, I do." "Then you understand that if you lose the battle, all materials are lost to you." "But that ship belongs to me. It is a symbol of my power." "Ma'am, you no longer have any power." "How dare you say that? How dare you say that to me?" "Yet we will continue to say that, because guess what? You lost. You got your ass kicked by a bunch of evil, hairless monkeys. That's what happened. Your own ship got penetrated so bad that several of our own rounds were going to probably be digging out of the engine compartment for 6 months. It was so easy to take down your ship, it's almost funny that you weren't ready for kinetic weapons. And all you did was have energy weapons. Even your point defense systems were energy weapons. Do you have any idea how easy it is to basically disperse any energy weapon that's fired at you?" "I am not an engineer, but we have the best ever." "Apparently not, because we end up trashing your ship. Not only that, but our engineers are having absolutely no problem figuring out how your ship works. We have a report right here, and they actually used the word rudimentary several times." With that, the Queen was confused. How could this new species believe that her ship, one that was developed and built only 2 decades prior, could be rudimentary? This was the pride of their fleet. It was an unbeatable ship as far as they were concerned, not only for the amount of weapons on it, but for the fact that it was so large that it would be almost impossible to take down. The bridge sat almost exactly in the core, which is, as she thought about it, probably the only reason why the bridge was not punctured by the rounds. She suddenly began to tremble slightly as she realized that one of these kinetic rounds had actually hit so deep that it only stopped at the very edge of her throne room. Had it been any more powerful, it would have actually gone all the way through and most likely had forced every single part of her bridge to be spaced. A fate that is so horrible, no one wants to think about it. They continued on. "With everything we have discovered about your species, you believe in strength over all. Is that correct?" "Yes, strength is everything." "Well, it's not enough." "Of course it is enough. Wasn't enough to kick our asses. It wasn't enough to beat us. It was barely enough to force our fleet to back up a little bit to stay out of your own weapons envelope. And it wasn't enough to make sure our new allies over there didn't trick you into going ahead, going full throttle towards us at maximum burn so that they fell behind so that they cut you off and stopped you from retreating." She turned and again looked at our four-armed foe, and now that smile was so wide that the halfling herself started to wonder how that smile did not hurt the four-armed's face. They continued on with, "Now, with everything that is going on, we understand that it took several months to actually cross the void to get here. We also understand it's going to be several months before they expect you back. Though quantum entanglement would allow for immediate transmissions to your planet, it doesn't seem that you use that." "I do not understand. It's not translating this quantum entanglement. Let's just say it's what we use. And what it does is extremely good. Along with that, we use a lot of our own basic technologies. Moving them together, you get maximum effect. And our maximum effect is what tore your fleet to pieces. We are in the process right now of still retrieving some of your people. Many of them are very, very injured. You're lucky, though. How are we possibly lucky by being taken down by brutes and monsters like yourselves? You're lucky that we're not the monsters you think we are, because our own medics are going in there, and if they have to, they're risking their own lives to save your people. And with that, the one in charge actually gave her a knife hand, and you could actually see him physically shake at the fact that she was degrading her people enough to think that they would actually fire at their rescuers. You do not get it, ma'am. We are not the most evil things here. Another voice chimed in, seemingly trying to stop the one in charge from actually losing his cool. If I may, sir. Ma'am, you do understand that if we were to actually wish you dead, you wouldn't be standing here, yes? She thought for a moment. Yes, that is obviously true, but you would not kill royalty. It is not done. It is never done. You never stop and kill any of the royalty, as they are gentlemen and ladies, and they must be able to command the forces and let them know what to do. They are beyond reproach and should never be fired upon on the battlefield, even if they are present. Everyone knows this. With that, around the entire area, the room started to erupt in laughter. Some of them belly laughing. They're laughing so damn hard. The Empress of 03 simply looked around and was confused at this. She couldn't understand. Finally, one of the ones at the board simply turned and said, Ma'am, you don't get it. You're priority number 1 to shoot on the battlefield. You don't get it. We don't care what your rank is. If you're a priority target, you're a priority target and you are dropped. If you are one of these folks who decides that nobody does anything without your say-so, that makes you not only priority number 1, but that makes you the only target. That makes you the one that people will go through hell or high water. They will completely almost rip themselves to pieces just to get their hands on your throat. So I recommend you understand that we humans do not go by the same rules that you do. We never have. Not in over 300 years of our own histories have we protected the officers or the royalty on the field of battle. If anything, we aim for them first, because as we all know in here, as he raised his arms to emulate, if you take out the leader, you take out the snake, you chop the snake's head off, the snake will die. Is it not the same with you? She snapped back. Absolutely not. If I was up there, I guarantee somebody takes me out, takes me down, I'm out of the battlefield. The next in line's going to be able to jump up and do just as good a job because I trained him to do so. She was confused. She didn't understand this way of thinking. How could you possibly say that only royal blood can lead? Only royal blood can command. Only royal blood should be able to speak, and I am assuming that all of you are royal blood, and that you are the only ones with the right to speak to me as so completely degrading as you are? They all looked at each other. Ma'am, no one here is royal, as you would think it. Using his fingers to almost quote. She didn't understand the gesture, but did believe it was an insult. Ma'am, royalty doesn't exist on this planet anymore, not since the first invasion. The royal families were actually hunted down during the first invasion. They were aimed at specifically. There's almost no castles left on this world either. You think they weren't targeted? I mean, that was actually, if you look over at 02 over there, she actually told everybody that if it looks like a castle, to blow it up with their main ships. They tried. Their weapons weren't strong enough to really beat their way in. They shot up a bunch of prisons, which was interesting. But that's the best they had. The problem is they didn't come for full-scale invasion. You did. And guess what? When your folks came in, they tried the same BS. They shot apart a whole bunch of castles, historical sites that will never be rebuilt the way they were, These structures are hundreds of years old, and you destroyed them. With that, another one put his hand on this one's arm as a way to try and calm him down. It was at that point that the Empress began to understand. So you believe in history? Of course we do. Without knowing your history, without knowing everyone's history, you are doomed to repeat said history over and over and over again, reliving the sins of the past. Do you not have something similar in your own doctrine? Our doctrine, our rules, are to obey the sovereign, the emperor or empress, and you will do so without question. We know our castes, we know our place. They are set when we are born, and they will stay with us forever unless something happens, forcing us out. But that is almost never the case. I have been empress for over 5,000 years. This made everyone gasp. And I will continue to be empress no matter what happens to me. They all looked at each other. 5,000 years? Oh, hold on. One. They all looked at each other and began shuffling behind papers, many of them turning their microphones off. They began to swipe through all their data pads and everything, trying to figure out what was going on. Turns out, their version of 5,000 years was only about 102 in human years. They all began to chuckle when they realized that. Ma'am, by our standards, you're only 102 years old. And thanks to the new technologies that have come out since the first invasion, we don't age either. What do you mean age either? I will never change from this form. So you're always going to be short and sweet? Which made everyone laugh. Short and... what? I'm short and tasty? Are you planning on eating me? With that, another ball of laughter came out. At that point, the one in charge and the one that actually said that lowered his head like, oh crap, I can't believe I just said that. I can't believe she just added on to it. As they continued the inquiry, they began to get a notice. This notice ran on every single one of the data pads, and they all turned, stopped the questioning, and looked at it. The Empress, still holding herself up straight with that lavish garb she was wearing, began to turn and look at everyone. It seemed like they were all getting the same notice over and over and over again. They all read very closely to see what was going on. Eventually, they turned back to her and very solemn. Ma'am, if what we're reading is true, and I need you to confirm this, when you conquered the sectors that 02 holds, you enslaved the population. Yes or no? Yes, as is the right of conquest, as we've stated before. And you've enslaved them in concentration camps. This did not translate. And she started tapping the translator. This did not say what it was. You've brought them into forced labor groups. And according to this, you are only giving them half rations? That is all they deserve. They have lost, and only the strongest of them will survive. Why would you only give them half ration? What does that serve? That serves to show the strongest ones, only the strongest ones that survive will be able to reproduce, and they will serve us as strong slaves from here on out. That is our way, and that is the way it will be, and they will be slaves forever. She turned and glared at 02, but hearing this, 02's Empress was not smiling. She had rage in her eyes. She was not happy. She simply turned to each of those in the council slowly, and then stood up and waved two of her hands, her species' way of asking to speak. Yes, ma'am. I believe she has something to say, gentlemen, if we will let her talk. Ladies and gentlemen, due to these enlightening reports, I ask one thing, and one thing only, and you will have an ally forever. I ask that you free my people. I beg of you. She then dropped down to all 6 legs, spreading her arms out wide as she lowered her head down low. She was already on her knees from her back legs, her 2 bipedal legs. This, in her culture, was how they begged. How they begged for anything to happen. This was to show she was exposing her weakest areas, to show that she was sincere. The council turned. The head of the council stood up, holding the microphone up so that they could hear him and he would not have to yell. Ladies and gentlemen of humanity, I know you're all listening to this out there. I know you're probably reading the reports right now. He motioned for his hand a little bit, and all the reports were immediately spilled onto the net. I want you all to look at these, to know that these reports are legitimate. I want you to remember our past. I want you to remember that we were going into a more prosperous future as we spread out to the stars, so this sort of shit would not happen again. This reflects on the darkest parts of our histories, a part that we had prayed that we had put behind us, a part that things like AI has circumvented. But now it is out there, it is in front of us, and we have a decision to make. And from here on out, I am asking this council, with the backing of all those out there listening, to declare a state of war against species 03 for the liberation of the home system of species 02. I ask this of all of you. Though this council in and of itself is its own republic way of doing things, I know that what we are asking goes beyond the areas that we want to cover, that this council was designed to cover. This was designed to help us protect ourselves, not to be the aggressors. But now, I don't know about you, but I don't see a choice. As he says this, a man in a uniform stands up and walks towards him from the side. He walks forward. There's a simple star on his uniform. Not 2, 3, or 4, but 1. Next to that is a symbol of one of their ships. On that symbol was the name of the ship. Hello, this is Captain Jones. You all know me. I was just up in space facing our new foes here, 03. I can tell you this, with or without the declaration, I know my men and women on board. We're going anyway. And with that, the votes already began. Even without a call for votes, they all came in. Green lights came on across the board. There was no red lights anywhere. They immediately chimed in, dinging all the way across as though a cacophony. The Empress of 03 looked aloft. She realized what was going on as all the governments across all of humanity were agreeing for a unified cause. She realized that she had only faced a small portion in space. As she looked over, she saw that some of them, she looked to translate, but she could tell that those were not flags. Those were planets. That was Mars. There's Venus. There's a moon. There's other moons. This one looks like Jupiter. What they were all saying that they're in. They're all saying that they're ready to fight. And now, for the first time, she was truly truly afraid. She started to shake. She looked to each of them and almost prayed for the first time that someone would come to save her. She turned back to the council and said, "You cannot do this. You cannot do this against us." With that, the one in charge of the council looked down at her and said, "It's done," and slammed his gavel down on the ground. And with that, she could even hear the cheers from outside the hall as everyone got ready for the fight. She realized that if they had taken down her capital ship, her flagship, the key to her entire navy, there was no way that the rest of her navy would be able to fight even half of the human ships, let alone what was going to be coming from their planets. With that, she was escorted off and brought to a holding cell. She could see on the way there several people looking at her. Some people spit in her direction. Most of them screamed different things at her, but she had taken her translator out. She didn't want to hear it. She simply held her head up high and walked over to the detention area. Once inside the cell, she saw that her command crew was there as well. They asked her, "Empress, I assume we're going to be released soon?" She simply responded, "No." For the next year, humanity prepared. For the next year, humanity rebuilt the flagship. For the next year, humanity stripped it down to its base components and refit the entire thing. And within a year, that gargantuan vessel looked nothing like it had when it entered the Sol sector. Instead of a bulbous, almost round shape, now it was in its true form, covered in industrial chic and brimming with weapons. The main guns had been replaced by several layers of energy weapons and also projectile cannons. Turrets were just strung upon the outside from the dorsal, ventral, port, starboard side, with several pairs of guns, each of them primed and ready to fire. One ballistic, one energy on each one. This thing was no longer an enemy ship. It was rechristened to a single word: retribution. The retribution would be the one to lead the human fleet. Not only was this ship ripped down to its components and rebuilt, but also all the colonies, all the planets of humanity had come together. Even those who privately owned ships offered their support as they, free of charge, were bringing supplies back and forth and back and forth. All they asked was a little bit of food and maybe small items like extra water, extra air, anything they needed to just keep going. But humanity had a single purpose. With this, video was being brought into each of the detainment areas, and they were shown just how far the humans had gone. This destroyed their morale. This caused many of them to actually rise up and start throwing things at their empress. Though some stayed true, some decided to protect her. Some decided that the empress needed to be the empress. They realized this was a losing battle. And she had done something to anger the humans, anger an entire divided species to come together. And it was going to be bad. The humans worked feverishly. Reports came down that many worked themselves into a coma and were immediately put in regeneration pods, trying desperately to make sure they stay alive. Though humans had the technology that they didn't age and they could keep themselves going, the body still has limits. Eventually, it got to the point where every single government, every single group decided to put in limits on how much time people could work. No more than 48 hours, and they must take a 24-hour break after that. When you're in space, you lose track of time. It's very easy to work for dozens of hours at a time and not even realize that time has even passed. But your body does know, as it will eventually wear out. This didn't matter to the humans, though. They worked until their eyes bled. They worked until their hands bled. They worked because their souls screamed. And with the retribution ready to take flight, almost the entirety of the Earth fleet was ready to go. They got ready with new engines, and Species 03 watched in horror as the human ships did not jump to FTL like all other species do. No, they seemed to go through what seemed to be a portal. 03's Empress watched on in horror as she saw the portal open up on the view screen in front of the entire fleet. She noticed that as the opening expanded well beyond, the stars in front of the ship changed. She thought this was a simple trick. However, as the ship went through the portal, there was a sudden jerk as she was yanked forward almost out of her seat. If not for the fact that she had been fastened to the seat by safety restraints, she would have gone flying across the bridge itself. The new redesigned bridge had the captain above her, watching over the entire crew. Each of the crew stations were reconfigured to be set up for humans, and they were extremely efficient. They began to move their hands across with a grace that she did not see in even her own subordinates. It was amazing how well they worked together. Some of them simply had to look at the other, give a strange expression, and they seemed to know what was needed to do next. They gave commands and orders to everybody. It seemed as though they all worked together as one, as a hive mind. She wonders if this was the true power of humans. She looked over to the Empress of 02, unrestrained but also in another seat, as she was solely trying to pick herself up off the floor from the sudden jerk of jumping from one system to the other. The captain simply called out, "Status!" and each of the stations yelled up to him with each of their status. They were all green across the board, as they said. The hell does that color have to do with anything? The Empress of 03 looked on as the view screen zoomed in to see many of her own ships now near 02's home planet. They had just jumped, somehow, several sectors in one moment, from one section of the universe to another, and this defied everything she understood. "How do you do this?" She screamed at them. Everyone seemed to not even give her a second glance. The captain, however, simply looked down and go, "It's fourth dimensions. You don't do fourth dimensions?" The Queen/Empress simply looked up confused, as she didn't even understand what he was talking about. He simply stated another thing. "It's quantum entanglement. You'll figure it out one day." With that, the entire fleet checked in, and she looked on the other view screens from everyone else and saw that every single one of the human ships had followed through this strange portal that seemed to end up right where they wanted to be. The human ships were already primed and ready to fight. As she looked at her own ships, the human captain went down to her, released her from her restraints, and stood her next to him on an elevated platform that seemed to be set up just for her. This time he would be right next to her, as she stood there, confused. "Open communications," he said. And with that, the video started. He could see a little bit of himself in the corner. He checked with his eyes just a little bit and then looked directly into the viewer. "This is Admiral Kleiner of the Earth Fleet. You will stand down, you will leave this planet, and you will release all your slaves. If you do not do this, we will be forced to fire on you." Within a few moments, another face seemed to jump in. "I am Supreme Fleet Admiral Shakna." This did not translate over to human, as everyone would have hoped. He continued, "And you have no right to do this. Our queen is already on her way to your planet, and she will end you. Highness?" He looked confused and just realized suddenly that she was standing next to him. She was up on the platform, yet you could not tell that that's where she was standing. So it seemed as though the human only stood about 50% taller than her, but it was clear that there was a difference in the width of the human compared to her. In the back of the video feed, he could see the Empress of 02. Both should not be there. The only one he should ever see is the Empress. The commander spoke again. "You are to stand down now." He looked over at the Empress of 03. "Your turn. Tell him to stand down." Hesitantly, she simply stated, "Yes, stand down. You will cease immediately. You will release your prisoners, and You do not give orders anymore. You have failed. You did not subjugate these humans, and you will no longer be our leader. We have a new Empress now anyway." The Empress of 03 looked surprised, shocked, dismayed, was seemingly saying with her eyes, "What?" With that, another picture came in, and this one was of another female, again dressed in the same type of garb she was wearing when she first invaded Earth. "You have been removed, Mother." With that, the humans realized what was going on. This was a royal pain in the butt. Both were just trouble for us. With that, the commander butted in. "Well, if you're not going to listen to her, maybe you'll listen to this. We already took down your flagship. In fact, we're flying it right now. But we outfitted it with our own weapons and technology. As you can see, we can jump into wherever the hell we want. Either stand down or our next target's going to be your homeworld." With that, the Empress from 03 reached up with her hands still in handcuffs, grabbed a hold of his uniform, and pulled down with fear in her eyes as she did not want her planet to be bombarded. He didn't even do anything except rotate his shoulder a little bit to signify for her to let go. The other Empress, the new one, simply laughed and then cut the video feed. The commander said, "Well, we got our answer. Are we in weapons range?" "Yes, sir." "Is the rest of the fleet ready?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Tell them to fire at will. Take prisoners if possible, but I want the skies clear." And with that, the human ships began to rotate their turrets and began to fire with reckless abandonment. The other side was confused. They believed that there would be an honorable duel. They would be able to have time to adjust their ships, get them into position so they could face each other muzzle to muzzle, face to face. But no, the humans did not give them a chance. Since 03's group was concerned with honor, glory, and tradition, and the humans were concerned with, well, winning, it was a very one-sided battle. Many of the capital ships that were around the planet were immediately taken down. Many of them simply exploded as their engines took too much damage. Others were sent adrift. Some self-detonated, and yet most launched their life pods and sent themselves directly to the surface, hoping to make a final stand. But if they couldn't stop the humans in space, they had no idea what was waiting for them on the ground. The human fleet had no problem moving into position. Those from the species of 02 looked on gleefully, but wisely said nothing. They simply waited for the humans to actually take the planet so they could have their home back. They knew this was the deal, and they did not want to spoil anything. They knew they would be duty-bound, life locked in to each of the humans that helped them out. They would owe them a debt that they would never be able to pay back, provided that the humans were able to take the planet. And yet they were happy and worried. Could the humans take the planet without having to bombard it, without having to glass the entire surface down to molten rock? This is what the Empress of 03 expected. She expected to watch as the humans moved into position and simply laid into the planet with their weapons. But the humans had a different idea. The captain simply yelled out to his XO, "All right, once we're in position, everyone deploy. Don't wait for us to get there. As soon as you're in position, deploy. And I want them to cry havoc. And release the dogs of war!" the entire crew repeated. This was confusing to both the 02 and 03 as they did not understand this. The Empress of 03 simply looked and said, "Release canines of battle?" Obviously, something didn't translate right. The captain turned to her slightly and then went back to viewing the screen, simply saying, "No, it's a phrase for total war, for a release of our people to go into battle with no preconceptions and no restrictions." She didn't understand. All she knew is that she watched as many of the ships altered their course so that their ventral side was facing down towards the planet. And then not only did many small pods, seemingly life pods, start streaming out of the ship at insane rates of speed, but also right behind them were multiple shuttles. Small atmospheric fighters went down in front of them, and then troop transports loaded to the gills with all sorts of men and materials. Not only that, but right behind them was another type of dropship. These had heavy weapons strapped to them. And at this point she realized the humans were not playing a game. She asked again, was sent out across all the communications. She begged for her own people to stand down, or else they will end up being slaughtered by the humans. The humans were more dangerous than they even could imagine, and what she got in return was a bunch of insults and laughter. Strange, odd cackling came back over. And at that point, she realized that it was lost. And all she could do was hold her head down as she watched the video feed of those in the pods landing right after their chutes opened, getting on the ground, the doors flying open, and they went out with reckless abandonment. Many of those on the ground, if they had the 4 arms, they didn't know if the humans had come there to destroy, so they fought as well. They were subdued usually, but more often than not, they had to take a few hits before they went down. They were about the size of the humans, although the humans were much, much bulkier. Along with that, the humans kept their body armor, their full body suit covered in some sort of metallic composite. She couldn't tell what, but it shook off all sorts of projectiles and energy weapons like they weren't even there. Not only that, but strapped to the back and also to the arms were a myriad of weapons and technologies. Many of them used flame to spray across. The flames didn't go out no matter what you hit them with. It was strange, and it was horrible to watch these halfling gnome things just burn. The species 03 was wiped out. The few that were knocked unconscious, the few that had survived any injuries, were taken prisoner and given immediate medical attention. Brought back, and they found out very quickly that the humans dressed in green, brown, or black, and sometimes even a dark red, were something to be feared. Certain symbols were to be feared beyond all else, but those that were in white, with a strange red symbol, a bar straight up and down, crossed with a bar that is horizontal. That was the one they wanted. That was the one they did not fear. As many of them went up to the injured who were screaming in pain, would immediately stop the bleeding and hit them with some sort of drug that immediately took away the pain. Then they would realize that these same armored-clad humans would pick them up and carry them back to a ship where they would receive more medical attention. They did not understand why would the humans do this. They didn't understand. The Empress on the bridge watched as the ceremonial chambers were breached. Fire came out like crazy. All sorts of blasts, all sorts of energy and projectile weapons came out the doorway, but the humans seemed to sit on the side of the doorways almost nonchalantly and waited. Then suddenly she looked, and on the video she could see a couple of them holding up these strange type of orbs. They were strange, surely. What would these metal orbs do? It was odd. Other ones pulled up these other cylinders, and they all seemed to shake them slightly. Then they all grabbed the side, seemingly pulled something off, and on one signal they all threw them in, bouncing them off the walls and into the chambers. And then a few seconds later, after they ducked to the side, there was a mass of explosions, bursts of noise, flashes of light, and huge concussive forces coming out. It was enough that she had to reach up and cover her ears because of what was coming through the microphone. By the time she opened her eyes after that, she realized that the humans were already inside, taking down any of the honor guard that was there. And before she knew it, the new Empress, her daughter, had come down with a heavy weapon and tried to shoot one of the humans and had succeeded. As she looked on with seemingly pride in her face, well, it was only there for a moment. The humans shot her so full of lead you could have used her as a number 2 pencil. Her body slumped and fell down the stairs, tumbling down each one like a slinky. A few moments later, and the battle was over. The humans had won. Species 02 was contacted immediately by their Empress as soon as she was able to be sent out via the comms. And then she was brought down to the surface. Every human knew that this was going to be a way to quell the population, to let them know that humans have come this time as liberators and not conquerors. The species 03 had seen its first true defeat in almost a millennia, and by a new species nonetheless. And before they realized what was truly happening, they were all brought into camps, but this time they were not treated to the whip, to the cane, or forced to work. No. They were given medical attention, beds to sleep in, cover from the elements. They were surprised. How could a creature so dangerous, so deadly, that it was estimated that they had only lost maybe 20 or 30 of their own, an entire planetary invasion? How could they be so nice? The Empress of 03 had finally seen what we call the duality of man, that we could be so dangerous and yet so kind to them, and she begged for an alliance with the humans, to the point that she actually went up to the commander and in front of everyone stripped her clothes off and offered her body as collateral, offered the captain to marry her and become part of the royalty, and by that the humans would be seen as equals. This was a law that was put into effect generations ago and was never used. Though the crew was a little put back at the sight of this halfling suddenly stripping off her clothing, and of course grateful that she had a basically humanoid body, basically a little more stout and a little more filled out in certain areas, yet you would be hard-pressed to not think she was a human that suffered from a condition that had been completely eradicated a long time ago. But in that moment, the captain simply walked up to her as she stood there, and she lowered her head, submitting to him. He simply reached down, put his fingers under her jaw, lifted her head, and looked into her eyes. "Sorry, ma'am. I'm already married." At this point, she was more than a little embarrassed as she stood there bare-assed to the entire crew, who was enjoying the show, although still trying to stifle their laughter a little bit. But she would find out within a month's time that they had zero interest in holding her people. They didn't want to hold them hostage, nor that they didn't want slaves. Their home planet was well beyond the sectors of humanity, and humanity had no interest in them. At least it wouldn't be for generations to come, and she was informed as such. Fairly soon, her entire population was loaded onto human ships, and they made another jump to her home planet. She, thankfully clothed this time, sent a plea to her own people to not fire on the ships as they were carrying refugees. Their own people were confused, and of course attempted to say that she had fallen prey to any type of sway. She was no longer viable as an empress, but that was until they showed the video of the new empress being torn apart by projectile fire, and they realized that the humans were not someone you wanted to fuck with. And with that, many of the ships landed, opened their doors, and not a single human stepped out, but they simply ordered those inside to leave. And once they were ordered to get clear because the humans were taking off. The door shut and the ships simply left. Those that had survived the battle were able to go home, and as a good sign of faith, humans had allowed another species to live. This one would not have a long time to rebuild as 02 would. 02 would have to not only rebuild their planet, but rebuild their civilization and their population all at the same time, which would not be an easy task. But they would not be alone. And as they looked at their broken world and tried to figure out how they were going to rebuild, they simply looked to the humans. One of them said, "How can we possibly do this? Our infrastructure is gone. We have no power." And the human simply replied, looking at all his gear and the ship coming down, "No power? No problem.